Since Dune is becoming popular with audiences around, today I'll be talking about how the novel compares to the 1984 version of that same title. I'll be going over the novel itself. I'll be talking about its author, Frank Herbert, a little background on the production of the 84 film version, and the main takeaways on why David Lynch's Dune failed. Dune was published in 1965. It was originally published in the Analog magazine. It was split over a couple parts. The novel was written by Frank Herbert. He would go on to write 5 sequels to that original 1965 novel. So you have the first book, Dune, which I have here, which I've read through. And then he followed that up with Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, got Emperor Dune, Heretics of Dune, and Chapter House Dune. I've yet to read the sequels, but they're on my reading list, and I'll get around to them eventually. Kevin J. Anderson and Frank Herbert's son would go on to write a number of spin offs and other related Dune works that still are released up to this day. So Herbert spent 5 years in the writing process, writing, editing, and revising. Some major influences that Herbert carried with him were The Adventures of T.E. Lawrence, which was the source for the movie Lawrence of Arabia, and Sabers of Paradise, which I hadn't heard of before. Paradise was released in 1960. Those two works really contributed to the story of Dune, really helped shape that foundation. My impression of the book is that it is a really great sci-fi story. It's very deep. It's a very layered novel. You really have to pay attention to all that Herbert will throw at you. The characters are all complex. There's a loaded backstory with all these different factions. You have the Bene Gesserit, you have the Navigators, you have the different houses, House Atreides, Harkonnen, Serena, which I believe is the Emperor's house. You also have all these political scenes that all these different houses are going up against each other, vying for power, and that's really the main motivation of why the story commenced in the first place. And my favorite character from the book is Gurney Halleck. He's just a very loyal guy. He's the guy. He's somebody you want at your right side whenever you're in trouble, and just his character is really badass too. So. And I don't think there's a poor version of Gurney Halleck in any of the film versions that have come out. So the overall theme that I believe Frank Herbert wanted to impart to the readers is to be cautious of your leaders. Obviously, when Dune was written, there was a lot of controversy in the U.S. government. You had the Vietnam War. It was a very dark time. Civil rights were going on. It was a time where you really had to take a second look at your leaders. Watergate happened in the 70s, which dirtied the reputation for the government even more for politics. So this novel was written during that time of political paranoia, you could say. So that was very evident in the book, and that is something that I would think all these film adaptations should carry in that adaptation going forward. It's as if these heroes aren't as altruistic as they seem to appear to be. They don't always have your best intentions at heart. They're only really in it for themselves. Their only interest is to do what's best for themselves personally, to do whatever they can to gain more power or more political power. And that's really at the heart of Frank Herbert's first Dune novel. All right, so I'm going to go over the early attempts that were made to adapt the novel. So the first attempt was made by Arthur P. Jacobs when he purchased the option for Dune. Rumors circulated that David Lean would be directing. I personally think that would have been a really cool movie to see, because David Lean is actually my favorite director. He was behind Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, Bridge on the River Kwai, and then A Passage to India, which I do think is underrated. So that would have been really cool, and I bet Robert Boltz would have been attached, and I think he's one of the best screenwriters from that era of filmmaking. It's really too bad that Jacobs died in 1973, and that film version never came into fruition. So what happened next? I bet some people who've been following just the whole story of the attempts made to adapt Dune have heard of Alejandro Jodorowsky's attempt in the mid to late 70s when the rights landed with him. The concepts were drawn up the art direction was being laid out. Casting was considered. I do believe they were considering Orson Welles to be Baron Harkonnen, which I think would have been a great casting decision. Welles has that gravity, and he's got that distinguishable voice that would have really done justice to the Baron Harkonnen character. And work was being done with the script, and from what I heard, it moved so far away from the source material that it became really unrecognizable. It wasn't Frank Herbert's vision. It was Claire Hodorowski was only taking the names of the characters and the title to make his own sci-fi film. It really could have been an adaptation of any random sci-fi story, and Hodorowski would have done his own take on it, which would be he would have probably done whatever he wanted to, and would have rather become his story instead of Herbert's or any other authors. Ultimately, Hodorowski's Dune didn't come into fruition, or it didn't happen because they couldn't find the funding, which makes a lot of sense because he was planning to make it a 10 to 14 hour epic, and it's going to be a little difficult to find funding for a movie that long. You need a lot of resources for that, so I understand a lot of investors have been like, no, we're not going to do that. So if you want to know more about it, I know that a documentary came out in 2013, Hodorowski's Dune, that really covered the entire timeline of attempting to adapt Dune. So, bringing the topic of this video into light, Dino De Laurentiis purchased the rights for Dune in 1976. So with Dino De Laurentiis as the producer, this version of Dune was realized. A little bit about the production on the 1984 version of Dune. David Lynch was hired to direct Dune by De Laurentiis. He was impressed by his work on The Elephant Man and Eraserhead, which I believe is the title. I hope I got that right. He was hired in 1981. Interesting enough, Ridley Scott had been hired before Lynch was brought on board, but Ridley Scott left the production because I believe one of his brothers had died during that time, so he left the project due to that. Lynch was responsible for 5 to 6 drafts of the screenplay. At one point, he was planning on splitting the story into 2 separate movies. That idea wasn't followed through. I think that's very indicative of what would come to pass later on. He really needed the time to flesh out the story, because Dune is just this epic, sprawling story that there's so many factors that come into play. You need a certain amount of time to explain what's going on exactly and convey that to the audience. A little bit about shooting. Film was shot in Mexico to save some money because labor was cheaper in Mexico than having the film shot in the US or in Britain or any European country. It was a troubled production. Not too many things went smoothly. A lot of issues came up, probably with the location, and shooting lasted about 6 months. That right there will tell you that the waters were a little rough for Lynch and his crew. So now I'm going to talk about why I think David Lynch's Dune failed. I know that there is a cult audience out there that sings this movie's praises, but that's not what I'm going to do. That's not what I personally got from watching Dune. I've watched this version of Dune twice. Once I watched it a number of years ago. I hadn't read the book or anything, and I was left kind of empty by the experience. It was just another sci-fi movie for me personally, but it did interest me enough that I went out and got the book and I read that, and it was a completely different experience for me. I really understood the story. I comprehended anything. There was so much more to the world than what was shown in the 84 version, and I think that's one of its problems for sure. It's really clear that the film is edited to a shorter runtime. A lot of studios and producers, they want their film to be around the hour and a half or 2 hour mark so they can have more showings and more screenings in order to take in a larger profit. So profit was very much in the minds of Laurentiis and his producers. What's clear is by watching the movie that it was intended to be a much longer film, probably around 3 hours or close to that 3 hour mark. There's a lot of scenes that were left on the cutting room floor. The pacing and the overall story are very affected by the producers and studios' decision to cut the runtime to the 2 hour mark, and the runtime for the 1984 movie is at 2 hours and 16 or 17 minutes, if I remember correctly. So why this damages the movie is that it really feels like a long montage with only a handful of watchable scenes that actually hold up. I felt like I was watching more of like a something that resembled Dune rather than an actual translation of Frank Herbert's text. It was very much scratching the surface at what this movie could have looked like if it were kept at a longer runtime. A great example of this quick pacing really backstabbing the movie is that all the characters for on the House Atreides side and the House Harkonnen side are introduced in one scene. You have so much exposition spewed in that scene while the characters are introduced. It really overwhelms the audience when you're watching, and I really understand why a lot of first-time viewers would be really confused because there's just so much going on there. They're just trying to rush to the finish line. We have to meet that 2-hour mark. We don't care if the movie comes out to be a jumbled mess. We're gonna reach that 2-hour mark, whatever it takes. Some of the scenes that do hold up that I appreciated when I was watching the movie for this video was the introduction of the Emperor and the Navigators. I really loved the design, the production design of the Emperor's throne room. The Atreides scenes on Caladan are really set to establish who these characters are, the intentions that they have. The worm riding sequence is probably the best scene in the movie. Some of the effects are a little dodgy, but as a whole, I still think that holds up. The spice mine inspection scene is one of my favorites as well. That's really indicative of Duke Leto's character, where he saves the lives of the spice miners. That's what he really values, the lives of the people he works for rather than the product that they're trying to extract from the sand dunes. The climax between Phaedrothra and Paul Atreides surprisingly holds up for me. It's a great action scene, and I think it serves as a perfectly satisfactory climax to this adaptation of Dune. The use of narration is kind of an interesting case in this movie because it's very unique. Narration is used to transition the audience from one scene to another to explain what's going on exactly without shooting additional material or scenes. This is pretty jarring, I think, and this is very evident of that quick pacing that the producers mandated, and it really hurts the movie because it really takes you out of the experience. And I'd rather, if you're shooting a movie, you'd rather show that visually than telling the audience what's going on. That's just a sin when you're trying to craft a film. Now, the reason I say this movie is unique in its use of narration and voiceover is that voiceover is used to communicate a character's thoughts to the audience. This is really a translation of the internal monologue that is within Frank Herbert's text. I haven't seen too many other films, or I don't think I've seen any other films try to replicate this in this way. In some scenes this does work, but overall I think it's too distracting to the audience. It's really takes away from the subtlety and the work of the actor, because again, film is a visual medium. Well, for a book it's all in text, so you do get away with all that internal monologuing. In a film, you'd rather have those emotions conveyed through facial expressions or gestures or something. You want to communicate that visually rather than telegraphing that to the audience. So there's really nothing to interpret there, and I think that's a really critical mistake. Now, there are deleted scenes available on YouTube that you can go and watch. I really do think that these deleted scenes added a lot to the movie, and I think if these scenes were kept in, it would have really added to the whole experience, and I think the film would have fared better if they were kept in. Thufor's death is especially a very poignant moment in the film. His fate is really ambiguous, it's unresolved, it's a thread that's left dangling out there. You have no idea what's happened to him, because there's one scene where he's shown to be tortured by the Harkonnens, and then nothing happens after that. In that scene, you see Thufir sacrifices the right life rather than Paul's. He pulls out his heart plug, and it's a great moment that would have really added to the cruelty of the Harkonnens and the justification of Paul's actions. And another scene that was deleted that I think should have been left in was the water is important scene between Dr. Kynes and Leto. it's really emphasized that water on Arrakis is sacred. Leeds spits on the ground to show his respect for the Duke, and in return, Leto pours out his water goblet. The water spills on the floor, and in that scene, also you have Gurney Halleck playing his Basilet. I think it's what it's called in the novel. He's known for playing that. That's a detail from the novel that I think a lot of the book fans would have appreciated, and it's just a shame that it was left out because those two scenes add so much emotion, and there's so much meaning behind them, and they're cut out. I do want to point out that this movie really got the casting right on the Atreides side, and the Emperor and those surrounding the Emperor. Kyle MacLachlan is terrific as Paul Atreides. I think I might like him better than Timothy Chalamet. Sorry, everybody. I really love Patrick Stewart as Gurney Halleck. I know he doesn't really quite fit the description that was in the book, but I do think he interprets the spirit of the character correctly. He's this hardened warrior, and I really love the training scene between him and Paul. And that deleted scene where he's playing an instrument, I also enjoy because that was stated in the book that Gurney is a man who loves poetry and is liable to sing and to play instruments as well. Then you have Freddie Jones as Thufir Hawat. He has a really good interpretation of the character, and the beautiful Virginia Madsen is Princess Irulan. It's really too bad that we never saw any of the sequels. I think she would have done a great job in the Dune Messiah adaptation that they might have done after this one. Now, what was really interesting was the inclusion of sonic weapons, because they don't make an appearance in the novel whatsoever. They are the reason for the Emperor turning against the Atreides and launching an attack coordinated with his Sardaukar and Harkonnen forces. In the original novel, it was really just because of Leto's popularity within the houses, the Landsraad, and the Emperor being paranoid that they would stage an uprising against him. So that was the original reason for him teaming up with Harkonnens, but here it's because of the sonic weapons. So I do think it unintentionally makes the Emperor's actions a little more justifiable in a sense. I believe they should have stuck closer to the novel, with the political tension being the main reason in why the events of Dune happen. I don't think it should have been because of the sonic weapons. It takes away from those deeper political subtext that I talked about a little bit before. I think the depiction of the Harkonnens were wrong. They come across as these clowns and these buffoons who are very maniacal, psychopathic in nature. There is that aspect of them in the novel, but it's much more insidious than what we see. And I do think that their menace is really taken away in this adaptation. I don't really take them too seriously when I'm watching the film. They all have orange hair and have these stupid costumes on. The Baron Harkonnen is portrayed to be this complete fool. There's nothing of that calculating image of a man that we see in Herbert's Dune. It's just a horrible interpretation of that character, and I think that Lynch was really the wrong guy for the job of adapting Dune. I think he stated that he's not a fan of science fiction, and there really are a number of inconsistencies from novel to screen. One of them which is that you can't really use your personal shields on Arrakis, and there's a scene where Duncan Idaho, played by Richard Jordan, which he was criminally underused in this movie, uses his shields when the Atreides are attacked by the Harkonnens. I think because technology isn't used as much, because it would alert the sandworms to the presence there with the technology. The main reason why I think this version of Dune failed is because it completely simplified the story. The Fremen people are given little to no complexity. They're just there for Paul to use for his vendetta against the Harkonnens. There was so much more to that culture and to those people. it's a very weak characterization of a people and a culture, and the whole world of Dune suffers because of that. It becomes a flatter, duller world that we are transported to for a couple hours. I think Lynch's most critical mistake is that he didn't understand the intentions that Herbert was laying down in his original book. That your leaders should be questioned and not to be revered. That's ignored in the story. That's most evident when Paul defeats the Emperor and rain falls down on Arrakis. That's not what happens in the novel. What happened was that the Fremen were taken on this holy war, the Jihad, I believe, and Paul was really the catalyst of that. There's no indication that there's any further conflict in this movie. The film ends with it raining down. It's clear that Paul is the hero and the savior of the story, and I think that's a complete misunderstanding of the original novel, because let me get this straight. Dune is not a white savior story. It never has been. It was not Herbert's intention for it to be a savior story. Paul uses the Fremen and the prophecy that Bene Gesserit planted really to his advantage in order to gain power for himself. He doesn't save the Fremen people. He locks them into this deadly conflict that there really isn't an end in sight. That's not what's translated here in Lynch's version. That is the primary reason why Dune failed, amid a number of other things that I talked about in this video. That's all I got for today. Hopefully you like today's video. I'm still staying on schedule, so that's a good thing. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe, because there's going to be others like it that are going to be coming out soon. And I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.